Meanwhile, I would like to remember that we are organizing the third edition of the Congress on Logic and Religion in Varanasi, India, at the beginning of November. And it's still possible to submit a paper until the end of this month. So everybody is welcome to send something and to join us in India. So our webinar takes place once a month, and this is the session of July. Today, we'll have as a speaker Audrey Pinsent from the University of Oxford. The title of his talk is Parables and Brains. And the chair will be Fábio Bertato from the University of Campinas, who is a member of the scientific board of the Logic and Religion Association. Please, Fábio.
Thank you, Jenny. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Father Andrew Pinsent. He is research director of the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion at the Faculty of Theology and Religion, University of Oxford. He was formerly a particle physicist on the Delphi experiment at CERN. Dr. Pinsent has degrees in philosophy and theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University, and in addition to a doctorate in physics from American College, he has a second doctorate in philosophy from St. Louis University. A major theme of his research is a second person, I-U, relatedness in science, philosophy, and theology. His publications include work in virtue, ethics, neurotheology, science and religion, the philosophy of the person, insight, divine action, and the nature of evil. The title of his talk is Parables and Brains. Thank you, Professor Pinsent. The word is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking to people from the United States, from Brazil, from India, I think. So greetings, everyone. I hope you're keeping well. Tudo bem, my Brazilian friends. Once upon a time, I used to work in Brazil. Trabalhava no São Paulo. I've forgotten my Portuguese, I'm sorry, but I had 4 years working for Banco Itaú in São Paulo. It was a very interesting time. And then I trained to be a priest. And I did because I was a businessman, I did a cost-benefit analysis. And I decided to invest in the human soul, which is a very good long-term investment. It's better even than computer systems and transaction management systems. And I started to study philosophy as part of my training. And this gave me a chance to think a lot about some religious questions. And one religious question was a very simple one. I was able to start thinking about questions I had experienced as a teenager. And one experience as a teenager, one thing that puzzled me, is why does Jesus speak in parables so much? Jesus is always giving parables, and to some extent, his whole life is also a series of parables. And the sort of question that bothered me as a teenager was, why does he do it? Given that there is some risk. You see, a parable has to be interpreted, and the danger is that the parable could be misinterpreted. So it seemed to me to be an inefficient way of communicating information. Now, as a teenager, I suppose I thought of information as propositions, and propositions seem to be most clearly, these things should be transmitted as clearly as possible. So why are these little stories so important? A parable is in the form of a very compact, very memorable story. And as I said, Jesus seems to use this genre for teaching all the time. And this question, which I had as a teenager, was also a question that Jesus' disciples asked him during his ministry. So I got a quotation here from Matthew chapter 13, verse 10. The disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" Why do you speak to them in parables? So this question that I had as a teenager is also a question Jesus' own disciples asked him during the time of his ministry. So I think it might be helpful just to give you one famous parable. It's called the parable of the sower, and it is also found in Matthew chapter 13. So this is how it goes. He told them many things in parables, saying, "A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they had not much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell upon thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear." So that's an example, a very famous example of one of Jesus' parables. Now, I'm assuming from the subject material, logic and religion, that most of you will be familiar with that story. If I was in a classroom environment, I would start asking you questions. But are you familiar with that story of the parable of the sower? Would you mind nodding your head if you're familiar with that? I think most people are nodding their heads. This is good. Okay. So so that's Jesus' account of the parable of the sower. And what's unusual is that he gives a very detailed explanation of the parable of the sower. So, and he does this to his disciples. So he goes to his disciples and he says, he explains each stage of the parable of the sower. And this is how he explains it. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. So you've got the first kind of failure. You've got a kind of path where there's no depth of soil at all. And the seed falls on this very hard surface and is taken away again immediately. Then he goes on. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is he who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the delight in riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is he who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. So, to summarize the parable of the sower, there are three kinds of failures. There is soil that's completely hard, and the seed is snatched away again. There is soil that's very thin, and the seed goes up quickly, but then withers away. And there's seed where there's also there are weeds, and these weeds or thorns choke the word, and it produces no fruit. So those are the three kinds of failures. And then there's also soil that produces good fruit, and in fact, a magnificent harvest, 100-fold, 60, or 30. So it's a very famous story. Jesus explains it in detail. That's nice. But the question in my own mind as a teenager was, why does he do it? Why doesn't he just give us the propositions at the end of the parable or during his explanation? Why does he bother with this story? So that was the puzzle that was in my mind for many years. I couldn't really understand why Jesus uses this method of teaching so much. And as your interest is in logic and religion, it's important to try to understand how Jesus Christ approaches the problem of teaching and reasoning about theological matters. Now, I studied 8 years of philosophy, including 4 years in St. Louis, Missouri, with a woman called Eleanor Stump. Some of you may have heard of Eleanor Stump, but she's absolutely fantastic. And she was my philosophical mother, really. And even today, she recommends books that I should read. And about 10 years ago, she recommended that I should read this book. It's by Ian McGilchrist, and it's called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. I'll just repeat that. Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And this very large book covers many things, but one thing it also does indirectly, I think, is explain why Jesus spoke in parables. So let me just briefly summarize the main thesis of this book. Ian McGilchrist was a scholar at Oxford, interested in philosophy, but he was also interested in some big problems. And one of the problems he was interested in is why we human beings, we carry around the most complex known object in the universe on our shoulders. And it's the most complex known object in the universe, but it's also divided almost entirely in half. This is a a peculiarity. The excuse me. The division is quite stark between the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the brain. It is possible that it can be cut completely, so the two halves of the brain can operate completely independently, and the person still behaves as a unitary being, as one being, not as two halves of a brain. So it's one of the peculiar things about human beings. We have this unitary experience, as there is that which says I in relationship to thou and in relationship to the world. That's a unitary experience. But the brain, which is the tool of the mind, is almost entirely divided into two halves. And Ian McGilchrist was very puzzled by this. Why is the most complex known object in the universe, with all its impossibly sophisticated connections, why is it divided in half like this? And I would also add a couple of other comments. Many non-human animals have divided brains, but the division is more severe in the case of human beings. So whatever function this division serves, it is more extreme in human beings than in non-human animals. So it's a puzzle. It should be a subject of interest to anyone who thinks about the nature of the human person. So so that's the situation. Now we've got a huge amount of experimental psychology and neuroscience in the last century, which has really highlighted certain distinctions between the two hemispheres of the brain. It is not an absolute distinction. It is a matter of degree. We're not talking about phrenology in an old-fashioned sense, but there is a bias. There is a distinction in the way that we use the hemispheres to grasp the world, and that's really the key point. There's a distinction in the operation of the two hemispheres, and in the way that we grasp the world using the two hemispheres. A lot of this book is about the details of that division, and there's plenty to say. There's plenty to say about history and art and language and music and culture and so much else besides, because the distinction permeates so much of our thought, including our philosophy. I think there's a tendency, particularly in the analytic tradition, to forget about the body and to reason as if we are demigods, abstracted from physical reality. But this is what Ian McGilchrist does, is really remind us that that's not real, that's not possible. We are very much linked with our bodies, and this is not a new thing. St. Thomas Aquinas says the soul is the form of the body. I'll just repeat that. The soul is the form of the body. So we are not like the software inside the hardware of computers. We are body and soul, and we need our bodies to think about the world, to apprehend the world in all kinds of ways. So how does this then link to the question of parables and so on? One way of thinking about this is the role of metaphor. And metaphor, well, I studied metaphor at school, but no teacher could explain metaphor, not properly. People think of perhaps metaphor as an optional extra in language, something that literary critics use. But metaphor is incredibly important. And you can think of many, many examples. To grasp an idea, you can't literally hold an idea, but the experience of grasping something is what is being evoked when we use the phrase to grasp an idea. Here's one from Brazil. So when I was working in Brazil, there was a phrase that was used, para inglês ver, para inglês ver. Have any of you heard of that, para inglês ver? This comes from the 19th century. In the 19th century, the British Empire started to be ethical, a lot more ethical, and we launched a campaign against slavery. And this was like the modern American war on drugs. So this was very expensive and very hopeless. So we sent the Royal Navy, and we spent billions of dollars in modern terms to try to stop the slave trade. And now, unfortunately, in Brazil, the aristocratic landowners, they wanted to keep slavery. So what they said, or what they did to when the Royal Navy arrived, when the British ships arrived, they said, we treat our slaves very well. We are very kind to our slaves. And this phrase, a phrase developed in Brazilian Portuguese, para inglês ver, for the English to see. It means looking good, looking good from the outside, even if reality is a bit different. And I was very interested to know that in modern Brazilian Portuguese, this phrase survives, but it comes from the fight against slavery in the 19th century. So, and it evokes very literally what it describes. It is putting on a good show, originally for the Royal Navy, but of course also it's used in modern business. It means to put on a good show for visitors. So we use metaphors all the time. We reflect on ideas. Now, we don't literally look at ideas in a mirror, but the experience of reflection, in some sense, communicates an understanding of what it means to reflect on something. If we understand something, we sometimes say, I see, and this is both a physical action with the eyes and the mind, but also it describes a cognitive action of understanding how things fit together. And understanding is often described in terms of vision, in terms of sight. So things connected with the body, excuse me, link into the way we understand things. And it's incredibly important. Some people today think that metaphor is the basis of all human language, that everything is frozen metaphors. And if your interest is in logic and religion, which is what I understand this group to be, then you've got to become masters of metaphor. And by the way, people who hate religion are also the ones who are effective are also masters of metaphor. So in my country, there's a famous man called Professor Richard Dawkins. You've probably heard of Richard Dawkins, yeah? Okay. Now, Richard Dawkins, he talks about the selfish gene. But this is also a metaphor. Genes are not selfish or unselfish. But by adding one word, selfish, he spins the whole of biological reality. And this is a very powerful example of the use of metaphor. Richard Dawkins, although he's described as a scientist, he's really a storyteller. He's a very brilliant storyteller. Now, passing from Richard Dawkins to Jesus Christ, you can probably see where my argument is going. Why does Jesus speak in parables? And it's really, I think, because the cognitive act of understanding rests on metaphor and narrative. We can't really understand something without metaphor or narrative. And this, by the way, is true in science, in mathematics. So often in mathematics, we have to have a mental picture of something in order to understand it. My father teaches mathematics to school children. He still does it at the age of 81. And part of his teaching technique is to teach students to draw pictures. So whatever the abstract mathematical description, he gets the students to draw a picture, because the picture is a way of expressing understanding and also communicating new understanding. So it's incredibly important. And part of our challenge today is our students use computers, but they are not very good at drawing often enough. So he has to teach them how to draw as well in order to get them to do mathematics. So why does Jesus speak in parables? Basically because it is the best way of teaching. If his goal is to communicate understanding, and if his goal is to communicate understanding, then he needs to use metaphor and he needs to use narrative. And what metaphor and narrative do is that they give or they evoke an embodied experience which expresses what is really meant by words and ideas. And with that, it's possible really to understand something. Now, as additional evidence for this, you can read Matthew chapter 13, verse 13, where Jesus gives a reason for speaking in parables. And he says this: "This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." I'll just repeat that. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So to communicate understanding, Jesus needs to, who is the Word of God in the Gospels, the Word of God communicates using stories, because stories are the best ways of communicating insight and understanding. What else can I say? Obviously, there are other reasons why parables are useful. I mean, one reason, of course, is that they are easy to remember. Another reason is that they are simple. You don't need a sophisticated mind, so they're very accessible to lots of people. But these are not the real reasons. The real reason for parables, I think, is that parables communicate understanding, and without understanding, there's no basis for knowledge, for real knowledge. What else can I say about this? I should also point out that this is the main issue, or the main problem, in artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is always stuck on the issue of understanding, or seems to be always stuck on the issue of understanding. Many of you will have heard of Searle's Chinese room, and also what's his name? The Turing test. So the Turing test is opposed by Searle's Chinese room, and what John Searle highlighted was that getting the right answer is not the same as understanding. And understanding is something different and something which is really more valuable than simply getting the right answer. And by the way, because many of you are from Brazil, it's a famous account of Richard Feynman, the American physicist, going to give a lecture in Sao Paulo. And he was, frankly, he was disappointed because the students, although they could get the right answers in tests in the University of Sao Paulo, they did not understand the physical concepts they were dealing with. So once again, there's a huge difference between getting the right answer and understanding. On that note, I must give you a short autobiographical statement. So 35 years ago now, I was studying physics in Oxford, and I was very young. I was 19 years old, studying physics at Oxford. And at the end of my first year, the physics professors met with each student in turn, along with the warden or the head of the college. And the professors spoke about each student. They used the third person. So while the student was in the room, they described how the student was doing. And when I got to the room, they said that left to his own devices, Mr. Pinsent will turn himself into a machine for generating a first-class honors degree. I'll just repeat that. Mr. Pinsent will turn himself into a machine for generating a first-class honors degree. But our job is to get him to do some physics. So they were very keen that I didn't just become an exam machine, but that I tried to understand and really properly the physics I was dealing with. Okay, so I've said everything I want to say. Why does Jesus speak in parables? Because it's the only way to communicate understanding. We need metaphor and narrative. And metaphors and narratives evoke embodied experience, which is very much linked to what it means to understand something. Well, that's it, really. I'm happy to take questions, stimulate discussion, whatever you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pinsent. Now we have time to discuss these wonderful ideas. Phil, you can make your comments or questions.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to make two comments because you didn't bring up these aspects. I want to bring up two people, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty, in a very provocative statement in Visible and Indivisible, says that the mind is the sublimation of the flesh. That's the first one. And the second one is, I presume that everyone's familiar with Husserl's distinction between noematic and noetic. And so the point that I would want to emphasize here is that in order to accomplish the noema, that is the concept, the understanding, if you like, the intentional object, there must be noetic accomplishment, which is an embodied accomplishment.
Right, yeah, yes. I completely agree. And I know that Merleau-Ponty and many others have sort of highlighted the same issue. But we're still wrestling with the Cartesian illusion of the body and the soul being detached from one another, and thought being a very abstract thing, completely separate from the body. So it's a constant battle, I think, against the Cartesian illusion. And certainly Merleau-Ponty did a great deal of work. A good example in modern research is the work by Boston Dynamics on artificial dogs and other robots. Probably Elon Musk will take them to Mars with him, I guess. But it's often very hard to get artificial intelligence to work well with just navigating a room or picking up an object. But the most successful robots have used a lot of have used distributed computing power, and have also been physical things, not just detachable, not just programs in a box, detached from the physical circumstances that they have to deal with. So I think there's a convergence, all kinds of philosophical streams, and also the practicalities of AI are sort of converging, or reminding us of the importance of the body, very much so. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Pedro, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Pedro. Hello.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And I just wanted to maybe raise a challenge or some kind of question to your presentation. You did mention in the beginning that metaphors can somehow essentially that metaphors by themselves can be interpreted in many different ways. We can say that there you know, if you talk about the meaning of a term, you could say it's polysemic. It can have many meanings. I guess metaphors, we can argue that by themselves they can also have many interpretations. So if we take the example that you used by Jesus on his parable, it's clear that there are two parts into his story. There's the parable itself, and then there's the explanation of the parable. And I think it is consensual that a metaphor by itself or a parable can be interpreted in many different ways. In this particular way, he chose it to interpret as conversion to Christianity, or those who hear the gospel and react to the gospel in different ways depending on their circumstances. So it seems to me that to challenge a little bit the perspective that metaphors are essential to cognition, I guess we'd have to explain how can metaphors by themselves stand without an explanation to give them the meaning that the speaker has in mind, and on the other hand, whether an explanation by itself can sometimes be enough to provide insight without the need for a metaphor. So in our example, wouldn't it have been the same to say if Jesus had said, well, you know, there are three kinds of people or four kinds of people who hear the gospel. There's the first kind who hear it and don't understand it. There's the second kind who hear it, understand it, but you know, they give up after the first try. There's and so on and so forth. So that'd be my challenge.
Right. I would make a counter challenge. So, although you say metaphors are capable of many interpretations, I think the experiences described by metaphor are often less ambiguous than that. I do agree that they can be applied to different things, but the experiences themselves are often quite unambiguous. But I do accept that there is some ambiguity. That is true. There's some ambiguity, and I think for that reason, metaphors have a bad press. So one thing that Ian McGilchrist points out is that the Enlightenment thinkers were often hostile to metaphor because the ideas expressed were not clear and distinct. But the embodied experiences, I think, are not very ambiguous, even if they can be applied to different circumstances. As for whether we can understand without metaphor, well, I don't think so. And Ian McGilchrist doesn't. So on page 292, he says, the importance of metaphor is that it underlies all forms of understanding whatsoever, science and philosophy no less than poetry and art. So now, of course, we can obviously disagree with Ian McGilchrist, but you have to take him on a bit, because, and that won't be so easy, because you know, he's done a huge amount of research on this very topic. So it's hard. Yeah. It's hard to explain. Can you explain any kind of understanding without metaphor? It's hard to do in mathematics and science, certainly. So, for example, here's physics. So I've taught physics. I try to explain nuclear matter. Now, nuclear matter, we have to use 3 metaphors. Nuclear matter is like a solid, it's like a gas, and it's like a liquid. So in fact, this strange material, which is very remote from daily experience, we need multiple metaphors to communicate its meaning. Sometimes we want it to express the aspects which are like a solid, even like a crystalline solid. Sometimes it's like a liquid drop, and sometimes it's like a gas. And all these things are true. So things that are very remote from human experience, we often have to use multiple metaphors, multiple complementary metaphors. But my central point remains, it's very hard to do this without metaphors at all. We sometimes have to use additional metaphors, maybe even that seem contradictory, but whether we can have understanding without metaphor, I can't think of any examples. So, but I'm happy to hear.
Yeah, well, I think you're probably right in the sense that you can't provide a full explanation of a certain kind without using some kind of ladder in order to get to the point you're trying to reach, to teach. But at the same time, in the example you give, which is quite, it's a good example, I'd say. It seems to me that it is still the case that everybody in the room that's learning about physics, in your example, still needs to know what they're talking about. So what does the metaphor is trying them to get to understand? You see, without that context, then to say that you're talking about a nucleus or a wave, then you lose the frame in which the metaphor can be a helpful way of getting an insight. So it seems that there is something going on between the two ways of us expressing ourselves, let's say.
Yes, yes. I would argue, personally, that metaphor is not something. It's like a ladder that you throw away when you're finished. It's brought up into the understanding of something. That's so it's not like a disposable space rocket, for example. But anyway, that's a detail that we could discuss perhaps on another occasion. I noticed some people are writing some things in the comments. Bo Branson is talking about the goal is that they are not able to understand, that listeners are not able to understand. I do agree that the language of the Gospels is a bit ambiguous here. And sometimes it's, I think, as an act of mercy, Jesus does not want to fully communicate an understanding of certain things. He says that will be bad news. So there are other I do agree there are other subtleties to the way Jesus works, but I still hold to the main thesis that the metaphors and narratives are principally to communicate understanding. It's very hard to communicate understanding any other way.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We have a comment in here from Antonino Drago. I think there is one more reason. Before literacy, people culture was theater, and a metaphor is a way to tell a theatrical action. But this is not a logical reason. Can you comment this?
I didn't fully understand, but it sounded like a common interpretation of Jesus' action, that he's describing he's talking to a primitive culture or a simple people, and obviously this is a matter of personal interpretation, but I strongly disagree. I think that the issue with using parables is not because Jesus is speaking to simple people, but because he's speaking to any people at all. And the best way of communicating understanding is to use metaphors and narratives. Just as my father today, when he's teaching maths, he gets students to draw pictures, because you need something to think about. You need something that shows the relationships of things in a sense of the whole, which is what you get with a picture or with a narrative.
Okay, thank you. Now, Julio Stern, please.
Hi, thanks for the beautiful talk. As far as I understand, Jesus has a nickname. His nickname is the Lamb. The word, the Lamb, in Hebrew is Haggadah.
Right.
The same word, or almost the same word, Haggadah, means story. So this,
right, okay.
This nickname, it's really a pun, a form of argumentation that in biblical hermeneutics is called paranomasia. So
right.
this nickname means Jesus is the storyteller.
Right.
The storyteller.
Thank you.
He's the one that teaches telling stories.
Yes.
And
yes.
I wrote a whole article about it that I put it in the
I see.
in the chat.
I see here.
And also recorded a video. So if you
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
If you would like to the reason for me writing this, getting it there, is not that I was so much interested in religion, but in science. In science, the positivist movement wanted to get rid of any form of story or narration of understanding, and present science in a purely mechanical way.
Yes.
And I was really arguing against this positivist idea, because I think it's rubbish.
I completely agree. And it is a revelation to go to the Royal Society in London. Go to the Royal Society in London if you ever get a chance, and look at the books on the shelves. And these are books written by people over the last few centuries. And I have to say, there's a lot of really crazy stuff. So what we get in our science textbooks is not the stories. We get a kind of sanitized, artificial set of logical relations, which have very little to do with the actual process of scientific discovery. So I think science is betrayed, I think, often by the way it's presented in textbooks, because the drama is often missing, which is part of the discovery. Now, may I ask, your name is Julio Stern. Are you Jewish yourself?
Yes, yes, I am.
I must that down. I have a great admiration of the Jewish people, and Christianity cannot be understood without Judaism. And maybe I use a phrase, or I think of a phrase to myself, is Judaism is Christianity for the right hemisphere of the brain. And often the genius of the Jewish people is to communicate by experience and history and story the same things we talk about in the Christian Gospels. And we Christians, we owe your people an extraordinary debt, and I want to mention that because it is so amazing that there's a phrase Jesus uses. He says, the salvation is from the Jews. And that is, I think, for the whole world, that is true. So thank you, sir.
If I could make a quick comment about this
Please.
metaphor.
Yes.
Exactly at the time of Jesus, Judaism was going through a bifurcation. One way was the way of the halacha, of the law. That's a
yes.
right brain, right hemisphere of the brain, reasoning, legal text. And the other way is the way of Jesus, the way of Haggadah, of storytelling, of parables.
Yes.
So
yes.
We have to put we have to arrive of a way of religion that puts both those ways back together.
I do agree, and thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julio. Now, Alexei Muravitsky.
Muravitsky.
Sorry.
Thank you for the bringing up a very interesting issue about the connection between metaphoric thinking and the distinction between two hemispheres.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to start with your remark in the beginning of your talk about the possibility of misinterpretations of parables or any text. And I would like to sharpen the issue and ask you, is it a possibility that this could lead to the problem of miscommunication or lack of communication? Because I think that the communication problem is the main problem of any religion. There is a possibility not only to misunderstand the command or a thought or from religion or of God, but even if you do understand it correctly in the right way, you never know that that's the right way to understand. You may understand that you understand God or Jesus, but how do you know that that's the right way? That's my question.
I do agree there's a problem. I suppose the simple answer is, how else do we communicate understanding except through metaphor and stories? But of course, there is this danger of misunderstanding. I don't think it's quite so severe as people think. People, I mean, how ambiguous is a story? I don't. It's not so easy to change it completely into something that's the opposite of what it is. For example, it's very hard to do that. but because the other thing is with stories is that the meaning is, it's like a fractal in science. You can pull out, you can pull out, you can pull out. So you listen to the rabbis interpret Exodus, for example. They are always pulling out new interpretations, and you can spin it off. The problem is not the disagreement, but it's knowing when to stop, because you can just keep going and going and going. It's very, very rich. It's like a fractal. It's not it can't be reduced to just a few words. So I'm afraid I don't have much else to say there. I don't think we've got any choice. I think one danger, though, has been the rejection of parable, or the rejection of metaphor, and the Cartesian demand for excessive clarity, because you can have a clarity which kills the thing you're trying to understand, it's counterproductive. You can demand too much clarity, and therefore destroy the thing that you want to try to grasp. So I think that is a danger.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Jaid, please.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the relation between the use of parables and the rejection of images by Jewish religion, Calvinism, and also in Islam. How do you see that?
Okay, so certainly in the history of Christianity, there's been a lot of argument about images, as you probably know. So in Constantinople in the 8th century, there was a war about images. Some people said we should have images, and others says it's evil. The 10 Commandments forbid images. And certainly in the history of the Jewish people, there has been quite a strong movement against images. I remember going to Israel many years ago and seeing microcalligraphy, where Hebrew text is used to create an image, and it's amazing. But this kind of representational image is not really is sort of regarded as a bit dangerous in traditional in some traditional Jewish circles. The change for Christianity is Jesus Christ, because if the Word is made flesh, we can draw God. For example, we can make pictures of God without blasphemy, without idolatry, and so in the end, Christianity decided images are a good thing, and we put them everywhere. And this is and we spent 1,000 years doing that all over the world.
Jaid?
Okay.
Thank you. Ricardo, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the talk. I'd like to talk about perhaps the core of your argument, because you said that Jesus spoke through parables or metaphors, because metaphors are somehow effective in terms of understanding. In the context in question, we are talking about, say, abstract ideas, and I would say, why not complex ideas? But my question is, when we go to philosophy, why metaphors are still viewed with suspicion in philosophy? It seems to me that the standard in philosophy is still, I mean, in terms of characterizing concepts, for instance, is still in terms of definitions. We are still looking for definitions.
Right.
And I can mention just one example within the philosophy, just one, okay, which is the whole issue about panentheism. There's a whole debate about the correct way to define panentheism in such a way that they distinguish panentheism from classical theism on one hand and from pantheism on the other hand. But many traditions, they have characterized their panentheistic views in terms of metaphors, like the famous metaphor that the cosmos is the body of God, and that seems to be rejected as a proper way to understand panentheism. So I'd like you to comment on that.
I certainly agree that there is that metaphors have a bad press, or have had a bad press in recent centuries, and this goes back to Descartes and the emphasis on clear and distinct ideas. So metaphors were seen as substandard ideas because of the ambiguity. But I think the people who made those statements forgot the role that embodied experience has in understanding. So I think we're beginning to recover the importance of metaphors. That's one reason I like this book. But there are others, like Metaphors We Live By is a very famous modern example. And there are other books that are beginning to recover this sense of importance. And I would also say that the best philosophers, they use metaphors quite a lot. And the best scientists, by the way, as well, the best science communicators use metaphors a lot. Here's an example. Albert Einstein said, "God does not play dice with the universe." Now, that's that's a very powerful image, and maybe it's not a true image, but it communicated what Einstein's criticism of quantum mechanics in a very simple way. The best science communicators use metaphors, and I also think that some of the best philosophers use metaphors. So my hero is Eleanor Stump, and my philosophical hero is Eleanor Stump, and she writes a lot about persons in relationship, but she doesn't just use abstract language. So every few paragraphs, she stops and tells a story. She tells a story. So in her book Atonement, she's always talking about two individuals, Paula and Jerome. So Paolo and Jerome. So she's talking about actual persons in relationship, and not only about abstract ideas and connections. So I think it's something we all have to use if we're to be effective in philosophy and in science and in theology.
Okay, thank you. Jaif made a comment in the chat. A hazardous symbol for chance, dice. Dice is a hazardous symbol for chance.
Yeah, it could be. Yes, yes.
and he put a link here too about this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Say, please.
Sir, can I ask another question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I would like to ask you. You mentioned 2 times that your father teaching math in high school uses drawings or visualization of.
Yes.
Yeah. I am a mathematician, and I teach math to freshmen and sophomore students. And I also use drawings and visualization of any kind. And I understand that this is very important. But at the same time, I understand the miscommunication, because when I draw a triangle and speak of a general triangle, it's a general triangle, but it's difficult to explain to students what is general triangle and why this theorem is true for all triangles, equilateral triangles or right angle triangles. Why is it true for all, and what it means for all, and not for particular triangle? And maybe you can comment on the behalf of your father how he deals with this. Because when I say students, let's consider numbers, explain them abstraction, that you can see number 0 or number 1 on the street or the marketplace. Have ever seen a number 1, but we still deal with 1, 2, 3, and even with 0, which is most problematic for comprehension. Thank you.
Yes. On the subject of triangles, you probably know that there was a revolution in the 19th century, and people realized that there could be non-Euclidean spaces with different kind of geometric rules. So triangles in Euclidean space, all the angles add up to 180 degrees. But triangles in a curved space, that angles can be greater than 180 degrees or less than 180 degrees. And drawing helps because you can actually draw the surface of the Earth, where
my question is a different one.
Oh,
my question is how to explain well, lower level students the connection between well, singularities and abstraction. If you explain something on a particular triangle, how to convince a general student that this is true for any triangle? It's not a pedagogical question. Yes. It's a philosophical question.
I don't have a general answer. I'm sorry. And I agree it's hard to go from particular cases to a general case. This is true
also for parables. If you explain the parable about the seeds in the ground, probably you could extend it to any other circumstances. It's not only about the seeds, it's about more than the seeds. Any parable has not exactly outlined the borderline.
I agree.
Kind of fuzzy thinking.
I agree. It's not perfect.
No, I'm not about this. About the difficulty to explain and to connecting the metaphorical well story with the real world. I agree. It's very important, but the difficulty always exists.
I dare not say anything except to agree with you.
Okay. Now, sorry for the mispronunciation. Rudy Schurman.
Thank you, Fábio. Hi, Andrew. Thank you.
Hello.
Good talk. Regarding the parables, I do not have a comment, but it's more a side comment regarding religious matters.
Yes.
I heard you mention we are body and soul.
Yes.
And I have some questions about this. First of all, where is mind in this picture?
Right.
I'm not sure if you want to take them one by one or if I should give them all three and you can react at once. I'm not sure. But maybe start with mind and you talk about brain.
Yes.
Which suggests mind rather than soul.
Right. I think you can say certain things about the mind, which are different to what you can say about the brain. And I think the correct way of thinking about the relationship is that minds use brains. I don't think minds are reducible to brains. But that's my view, and that's a matter of some controversy.
Right. So where then does mind fit in between body and soul? Or do you think soul is mental or no?
Well, a large part of what we mean by soul is mental. I do agree, but it's not the whole story. So we're not just our minds. Now, to go back to Aquinas in the 13th century, he talked about the soul as the form of the body. So it's not just the mind, but the organizing principle of all the matter. So, and there's a difference between a living thing and a dead thing. So one thing I see as a priest is death. I see death, and you can move from, and the matter is almost exactly the same between a person who's about to die and the person who has died. But the appearance is completely different. And I'll give you an example. 1 year ago, I discovered my mother. My mother was dead. Suddenly on the 3rd of July, 2021. And I knew instantly that she was dead. And my father also could see that she was dead. So the animating principle has gone, and you can see it in the face. So there's so the term soul is the name we give to that animating principle, the name we give to the organization of the matter. And I agree that an important part of that is the intellect, but it's not the whole story. It's bigger than that.
Yes. So you're saying soul is more something like consciousness? No,
I'm not saying that. I'm saying the soul is the form of the body. Consciousness is a kind of modern thing. It's I think attention is more primary than consciousness. So a young baby attends, but a young baby may not be self-conscious, for example.
That's a different topic, I think, self-consciousness.
Okay, it's a different topic. Okay, so how do we define consciousness? If you, I think it is better and perhaps more straightforward and more basic to talk about attention. And from attention, we get joint attention, and then we get self-consciousness.
Right. So you would not say that the soul is the same as the body?
No.
No. So how can we be different things?
I mean, how can the soul be different?
How can we, let me put it differently, how can we be identical with two non-identical things?
Well,
from a logical point of view, that is difficult.
Well, I've given you an example. There's a difference between a person who is still alive and a person who's just died. The matter is almost exactly the same, but the form has gone in the second case. And I think anyone who's experienced that will say there's a difference. And the term soul is the name we give to the difference. I'm not sure we can do much more than that.
No, but I totally agree, or I can largely agree with that view.
Great.
But it means that the soul, if the soul can leave the body, then we must be either the body or the soul, or there are two selves, one in the dead body and one in the soul that is left.
Well, I think you. Okay. I'll give you. This is a contentious area. I have a student writing a doctorate on this topic, so I know it's a very complicated area, and people have different views. I would say that we are not identified completely with the soul or with the body. We're meant to be embodied souls, if you like. We're meant to be physical beings, and the soul is the name we give to one aspect of that being. I'm not sure. I can't do any more than that. I'm sorry. But if I may suggest, your group probably should have a discussion of souls and bodies, because that's a huge topic in itself, and I think you should have someone who's who does research into this area, and you'd probably have a lot of fun.
I'm doing this with Mr. Swinburne,
Great.
and
He's interesting. Yeah.
we're having good fun at it. But he cannot answer how we can be identical with two non-identical things, or to put it in other words, how we can be a part of ourselves. Both of these claims seems contradictory.
Well, then
So-
you'll have to argue with Professor Swinburne.
Yes,
Good
yes.
luck.
No, I was hoping you had a clever solution.
I
Could
don't have a
help us
clever
out.
solution. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Thank you anyway.
Thank you. Francisco de Assis remarked that we had Richard Swinburne talking about this. The video is in the YouTube page of the group.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Now, Martin Terpetinsky, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Pinsent, for your talk. It was a great pleasure to listen to your talk. I'm Christian too, and I accept and agree with your approach. But you gave an explanation. I'm dealing with reasoning in biblical exegesis, so it's very important for me what kind of reasoning we are dealing with. So this is an explanation. So some possible reason, yeah, to explain why Jesus used parables. But it's a bit problematic because maybe you're right, but maybe there are other reasons. How do you? And I'm curious about how you react to the opponents who would say, no, we don't accept this reason. We can explain it historically. Perhaps Jesus wanted just to follow some tradition, or perhaps Jesus was a smart guy who used the kind of strategy that when he uses parables, it's more attractive, and maybe he creates a situation where he becomes a master because he gives some riddles, and others are, became disciples because they're trying to solve it and guess what he's talking about. Yeah, so we can imagine some opponents who produce such arguments. So how would you react to this problem?
Well, first of all, in offering a cause, I'm not saying it's the only cause. So there are many examples in science, and this goes back to Aristotle. So if you ask a question, now this is not very helpful for my Brazilian colleagues because they don't have kettles, but why does a kettle boil? Why does a kettle of water boil? You can give many answers. You can say electricity flows through the element. It heats up the filament, which raises the temperature of the water, which causes the kettle to boil. And you can also say the kettle is boiled for me to have a cup of tea. So you can give many causes for the question why. And I also add that children do it all the time. Children are natural philosophers. So in England, young children say, why? And in the English language, the first word of a response is because the cause of the being is, and it's not an exclusive thing. So often there's more than one cause to explain why something is the way it is. So I don't disagree. So my explanation is not the only way. It's not the only possible account we can give of why Jesus spoke in parables. I can think of a couple of others. It's attractive. Yes, I do agree. They are more memorable, so it helps in an oral culture where you don't write things down so much. It is, and also because it's very compact, and you can draw out other things from it. So from the parable of the sower, I think the idea of the word of God going into the ground also describes the dynamic of nature and grace, which is another whole theological topic. So so it's a very compact, incredibly compact way of speaking. So I can do nothing except agree with you that that there's often more than one cause, and I would stress that the explanation I've given is not meant to be exclusive. That there's no other reason, although I think it is probably maybe one of the primary ones.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, I'm sorry again for the mispronunciation. George or George Vasilas.
Never mind. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for the interesting presentation. I would like to try to provide some elements of biblical ground to what you presented. I'm not a philosopher, just a theologian and semiotician, but as I understand, on the one hand, we have like a Jewish approach of knowledge and understanding, which I can summarize with the phrase, I will understand by doing.
Yes.
And on the other hand, we have this Greek way of thinking, which is, I want to understand in order to do. So in the Greek spirit, we have Greek philosophers that talk by definitions, and on the Jewish spirit, we have parables. Well, we can argue that definition is another form of parable, huh? But as
that's nice.
Yes, that's how I understand it. As modern thought was mostly influenced by ancient Greek philosophy, I think that definitions became the way, a form of speech in the science, whereas parables remain on the background. That's one thing. The second thing is that biblical ground that I talked about. You know that the verb gignosko, which means know. In the biblical understanding of the verb is knowing by experience, not by cognitive procedure.
Yes.
Which means that this understanding, this knowing by experience, is embodied in the Jewish way of thinking. And this is what we think, this is what I find in parables. Like parables is the way to speak of experience, or making experience by speech, something like this, making experience by speech. So this is what brings together knowledge and experience. Which on the Greek ground, we find it in the ancient Greek theater. The ancient Greek theater is like the embodiment of philosophy, which is the closest we have to experience. Like we see actors experience philosophy and we understand it like this. So, and the second thing that I would like to say is the danger of misunderstanding, which is maybe avoid in a certain at a certain point when it is a common understanding, when it becomes a common understanding, like ecclesia coming together under a common understanding of something. So, do you remarks about this?
Well, I agree with everything you say. I think it's fantastic, and I do agree that the Jewish experience is linked to doing, and it's often the basis of all their understanding. And it's true also in the sciences today. So here at Oxford, we get our students to do experiments in science, and they have to do a lot of work in laboratories, actually doing, working bodily with equipment and making measurements and so on. And and without that, they can't really be properly called scientists, because you got to have that embodied experience of things. So I don't have anything intelligent to say except to agree very strongly and to thank you for your comments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's taking the opportunity, Professor Pinsent, I'd like to share with you and all the attendants here that Professor Eleanor Stamp will talk to us in December. Everyone is invited to participate in this next event.
This woman changed my life.
She's wonderful.
I'm very grateful to Professor Stump. Yes.
You're right. She's very, very wonderful.
Yes.
Now, Monica Freitas, please.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your speech. Very nice. It was really appreciate very much. I'm a Christian myself. Well, yes. So my question is rather simple. I was wondering if the reason Jesus used parables to talk to people would be a kind of methodological approach rather than anything else.
My apologies. Someone's just at my door. Could you just give me one moment? I'll come back in a moment.
Okay.
Hello. You come in. I'm just in a webinar. So you come in. Sorry. I'm just finishing a webinar. Okay. You come in, please. My apologies.
Okay, I will resume it. Okay.
Thank you.
So I was wondering if one of the reasons that Jesus decided to use parables to talk to people was methodological rather than anything else, because at that time, because he wanted to express very complex concepts in ethics. Okay, let's say so. And people at that time, they were not intellectually developed to understand that. Okay, so parables and metaphors was the only thing available. Let's say so. Let's suppose we have a time machine, and I come back to that time in my time machine, and I have my cell phone. And how can I explain people about software, about chips, about everything? So I have to use parables. So I think, I don't know, perhaps one of the reasons is that we have a lot of complex concepts, and they didn't have the intellectual apparatus to understand it.
Okay.
And this is just, I just was wondering, it's a very simple thing, perhaps. Thank you.
Yes, and I agree, but personally, I'm very cautious about chronological snobbery. So it's very easy today to look back in the past and say people were simple or stupid. But today we have all these sophisticated intellectual tools. Personally, I disagree. I think that every human being at all stages in history, we need to use metaphor. We need to have mental images. We need to draw pictures. I don't think it's unique to the past. That's so I agree with you, but I would resist slightly anything which sort of makes it sound as if people in the past were stupid, because I think this is a universal human need. We need embodied experience. We need metaphor. We need a narrative. So that's my own view, although I'm happy to be challenged, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think that we still need metaphors, because we still have a lot of things to develop intellectually.
Absolutely.
So we still need them. The point, I don't consider them stupid. I just say that we are on a continual develop. Yeah. So at that time, they couldn't understand some of the concepts we understand now. And now we cannot understand some concepts that we will understand in the future. And we still use a metaphor. You still need them. They are not accurate, but that's what we have now for some areas of knowledge.
Yes,
that's what I meant to be. I didn't mean that the people there were stupid.
Thank you. But I must apologize. I have another meeting now, so I need to go. I'm sorry to say. I hope that's not too disappointing. I don't know how long. I don't know how long your meetings last. Is it an hour? So we've been an hour and a half, and I have to say goodbye. So sorry about that. Maybe you've got final comment or final questions.
Okay, Stephen Voss can make some comments and we finish.
Thank you.
Okay. Stephen, please.
Stephen.
Voss.
Stefan.
Depends on the nationality. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Hello, Stefan. I can't see you.
Yes. I'll be very fast. This was a beautiful session and we have much to think about. Two quick thoughts. A related question, why did Jesus do miracles like turning water into wine or driving 1,000 demons out of some guy's head?
Right, okay.
He was able to do things that were flesh and blood parables. We learn from those miracles.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and often they are, as I like what you say. They're flesh and blood parables. Yes, that's right.
And another thought is, I appreciate the relation between metaphor and parable, or if it was a simile, like my beloved is similar to the moon over the dark and stormy sea, the response would be, in what way? There is one suggestion, one way of similar, but if you just say, my beloved is the moon over the sea, you invite meditation on the similarities. And that's what the parables also call forth in us.
I agree. That's obvious. Thank you. And of course, the stories of the Jewish people as well. They're like flesh and blood parables. It's very powerful.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Pinsent. It was a wonderful moment we had here. And I hope you can meet with us together in next opportunities. And I hope to see everyone in the next month in the nous webinar. Thank you, Professor
Thank you.
Pinsent. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Please, can you say a few words about the next session?
Sure.
Hello, everyone. Just a quick reminder for our next webinar. We'll have Professor Stan Krajewski as the speaker. He will be talking about mathematical models in theology. So he will be reviewing some mathematical illustrations of religious concepts. The chair will be Professor Ali Sadek. And this webinar will take place August 18th. So you are all invited to come again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you. Bye-bye.